In 1983, when plantation records from the Savannah River Valley were finally unsealed after more than a century of silence, archivists expected the usual ledgers, crop inventories, purchase lists, labor records, and the cold arithmetic of a slave-based economy. Instead, they uncovered something that disturbed even seasoned historians. On the Hartwell estate, one of the largest and wealthiest plantations in Burke County, Georgia, stood a single enslaved woman's cabin that appeared completely out of place. At first glance, it matched the other crude dwellings lined up behind the main house, but a closer inspection revealed details no enslaved person was ever permitted to possess. Hand-carved wooden molding traced the ceiling. A solid brick fireplace sat in the center with ironwork too decorative to be practical. Glass windows, not shutters, not slats, but real glass, were framed by fabric curtains. And in the corner was a locked trunk containing personal items far beyond the reach of any enslaved woman. Embossed stationery, a silver-backed mirror, folded linen, even a pair of soft leather shoes. The plantation ledgers identified the woman who lived there only as the mulatto Rose, a description that did little to explain why she had been afforded conditions better than many white tenant farmers of the era. The archivists understood immediately that the cabin had never been meant to draw attention. Its exterior was intentionally plain, identical to the surrounding structures so that no passerby would suspect it held anything unusual. But inside, everything contradicted the brutal logic of slavery. These were the belongings of someone kept apart, someone isolated, managed, and controlled with a precision that suggested purpose far beyond labor. The discovery raised questions that county officials refused to answer for decades. Why had one enslaved woman been housed alone? Why were records connected to her sealed? Why were parts of the estate's documentation missing or so heavily redacted they were unreadable? Whatever happened in that cabin in 1851 was serious enough that the surviving Hartwell descendants paid to have the archives restricted again, an act that fueled whispers of scandal, crime, and a truth too dangerous to surface publicly. But long before archivists ever stepped foot inside that abandoned structure, the world of the Hartwell plantation seemed perfectly ordinary. The year was 1851, and Burke County thrived on its usual mixture of cotton wealth, rigid social structures, and the daily violence that upheld both. The Hartwell estate spread across 2,000 fertile acres along the Savannah River, about 20 miles southwest of Augusta. It was one of the most prosperous properties in the region, producing cotton, tobacco, and rice with the forced labor of 143 enslaved people. To visiting planters, the estate represented success. To those who labored there, it was a landscape of exhaustion, control, and the constant threat of punishment. The main house stood proudly above the fields, a Greek Revival structure with white columns that caught the early sunlight and cast long shadows across the magnolia-lined driveway. Everything about the house was designed to display refinement. The imported furniture, the polished floors, the china cabinet stocked with Charleston porcelain. The Hartwell family had positioned themselves as pillars of local society. Thomas Hartwell, the plantation owner, was regarded by neighbors as a progressive man, a term that, in this context, meant he preferred psychological domination and strict organization over overt brutality. He used the whip when necessary, but he prided himself on discipline achieved through fear, surveillance, and calculated benevolence. He kept immaculate records, attended church every Sunday, and served on agricultural boards that shaped regional policy. His wife, Catherine, came from a respected Charleston family. With delicate manners and refined education, she served as the social face of the plantation. To the outside world, the Hartwells were a model household, financially successful, socially polished, raising 2 children in proper Southern fashion. But behind the facade lay tensions and secrets that would soon unravel everything. The enslaved community lived in 2 rows of rough cabins behind the main house. These dwellings had dirt floors, no insulation, and shared fireplaces fashioned from mud and sticks. 10 people sometimes slept in a single room. They survived each week on rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses, and worked from dawn until darkness. Their lives were predictable only in their hardship, except for one cabin. It stood slightly apart, 30 feet away from the others, close enough to seem part of the row yet positioned just far enough to mark difference. From the outside it looked unremarkable, but the wood was newer, the door hung straighter, and a small vegetable garden grew nearby, an unusual privilege for enslaved people. Most striking was the silence surrounding it. No children, no communal laughter, no shared cooking fires. Only one person lived there. Her name was Rose. Her arrival in the summer of 1848 marked the beginning of a mystery that, decades later, historians would still struggle to untangle. Purchased at an estate sale in Augusta for an unusually high price, described as beautiful, refined, educated, she immediately drew attention, not only from the enslaved people who sensed something dangerous in her isolation, but from the Hartwell family, whose private intentions for her would not become clear until tragedy forced the truth into the open. And in that isolated cabin, her prison, her mirror, and ultimately her weapon, Rose began a quiet battle that would one day expose the darkest corners of the Hartwell legacy. A humid spring morning settled over the Hartwell plantation in 1851, the kind of morning where the air clung to the skin, and the river smell drifted over the fields, and on that morning nothing seemed out of the ordinary as the household stirred to life. Enslaved workers moving toward the fields, kitchen fires being lit, and Thomas Hartwell reviewing his ledgers with the precision of a man who believed order could prevent chaos. Yet beneath the routine lay an unease that only a few could sense, especially those who watched quietly from the edges. The estate itself stretched across 2,000 acres, with rows of enslaved laborers moving like shadows through cotton fields that demanded endless tending, while the main house stood elevated and immaculate, crowned with white columns meant to express dignity and success. Though within its walls the Hartwell family lived a life more fragile than the polished veneer suggested. Thomas, now 38, was known among other planters as a calm, methodical man who avoided public displays of temper, using instead a calculated mix of rewards, isolation, and implied threats to maintain control. But those who lived under him knew that this calmness was simply another form of domination, one that forced compliance through fear of unpredictable consequences. His wife Catherine navigated the household with a gentleness that masked her own anxieties, trying to maintain the appearance of harmony while feeling increasingly trapped in a marriage shaped more by obligation and social image than affection. And their children, Richard and Anne, were being raised to inherit the plantation's rigid hierarchy without ever questioning its foundations. Behind the house, the enslaved community lived under constant scrutiny, their cabins arranged in 2 disciplined rows like a physical reminder that even their homes were controlled spaces, each one cramped, drafty, and shared by large families who survived on rationed food and tiny slivers of rest, yet found ways to support one another through shared stories, whispered songs, and the quiet exchange of warnings. But the last cabin in the western row stood apart, its isolation impossible to ignore, and after Rose arrived in the summer of 1848, this separation grew more deliberate as she was removed from the social world of the other enslaved people and placed into a solitary existence that none of them could explain. The whispers began almost immediately, traveling from cabin to cabin the way rumors always do among people who must rely on each other for survival. They noticed the way she walked, her refined manners, her educated speech, the way she seemed too composed to have lived the life they all endured, and they noticed even more the way the master watched her. Rose herself rarely spoke, moving with the air of someone who understood that every word would be measured, every glance interpreted, and while she performed the tasks assigned to her, she observed quietly, learning the rhythms of the plantation, the overseer's rounds, the children's lessons, the times when Catherine withdrew to her room, the meetings Thomas held with neighboring landowners, and though she appeared passive, she was assembling a map in her mind of power, weakness, and opportunity. Her cabin, though outwardly ordinary, contained objects no enslaved woman should own, and these private objects told her that her condition was not privilege but confinement, that she had been chosen for something far more ominous than domestic labor. She sensed Thomas's intentions before Catherine ever confirmed them, sensing in the way he spoke to her, in the way he arranged her isolation, a hunger for control that went beyond ownership, a need to mold her into something she did not yet understand, while the other enslaved people kept their distance, unsure whether proximity to Rose meant danger or favor. She spent her evenings alone with an oil lamp and a blank journal, an object forbidden to her but essential for survival, writing down every detail she observed, the strange silences in the main house, the tension in Catherine's voice, the way Thomas's moods shifted when certain names were mentioned. She did not yet know the full story, but she felt trapped in a pattern older than her present. On the plantation, an unfinished history that seemed to tighten around her like an invisible cord. The turning point came when Catherine fell ill one spring morning, and Rose was unexpectedly summoned to care for her, brought into the heart of the household not as a servant but as a witness to aid. Private unraveling, and it was in Catherine's whispered confession, fragile, trembling, and drenched in fear, that Rose first heard the name Louisa, a name the plantation had buried, a name that carried with it the weight of a tragedy long concealed. Catherine's story opened the first crack in the carefully constructed façade of the Hartwell family, and as Rose listened, she felt the full danger of her position settle upon her, realizing that her isolation was not favoritism, but a deadly pattern repeating itself, and that if she did not act, she would meet the same fate as the woman whose memory she apparently resembled so closely. From that moment forward, every step Rose took, every word she chose, and every entry she wrote in her hidden journal became part of a quiet, deliberate fight for survival, one that would soon transform a seemingly ordinary spring morning into the beginning of a reckoning the Hartwell estate had never expected. Catherine's whispered revelations did not leave Rose in shock for long. Instead, they sharpened her awareness of the danger she was living inside, pushing her into a state of constant vigilance as she cared for the woman whose mind hovered between clarity and fear. And in the days that followed, Rose began moving through the Hartwell household with a deliberate calm that concealed the urgency growing inside her, watching every expression on Thomas's face, studying each shift in his tone, and reading silently into every conversation that passed between members of the house. She understood now why she had been separated from the others, why Thomas had purchased her for an unusually high price, why she had been given new clothing and rations no one else received, and why every boundary around her life seemed constructed not to elevate her but to contain her. Catherine's story had woven the final threads together. The murder of Louisa, the sudden drowning explained away as an accident, the scratches that no one properly questioned, the rushed marriage months later, and the way Thomas had immediately tried to shape Catherine into the same ideal Louisa had refused to become. Rose saw it clearly now. She had stepped into the shadow of another woman's fate, a fate designed by a man who hid his obsession behind the polished manners of a Southern gentleman. And each time Thomas called her to the main house or spoke her name with slow deliberation, she felt the line between past and present tightening around her. Yet Rose did not allow fear to paralyze her, for she had learned long ago, back in the northern household where she had once lived freely before being sold south, that fear could be a tool if it was understood rather than obeyed. So she continued her careful observations, noting the hidden patterns inside the household. Thomas's habit of watching Catherine through half-closed doors, the way he lingered outside Rose's cabin on nights when he believed everyone asleep, controlled fury in his voice whenever Catherine asked about her sister, and the way the overseer Fisher seemed wary rather than loyal, as though he knew more about the Hartwell family than his employer would ever admit. Rose realized that if she wanted the truth, she needed to gather it quietly, and from every direction, so while she served Catherine her meals and read devotional passages aloud to soothe her anxiety, she asked soft questions that seemed harmless but were calculated to fill in gaps of the story, and Catherine, relieved to finally unburden herself, spoke with a mix of sorrow and urgency about the sister who had once been her closest companion, describing her confidence, her quiet strength, her reluctance to marry a man she sensed was controlling, and the final days before her death, when she confided fears that she might not survive the upcoming trip to the river. Rose recorded all of it at night under the faint glow of the lamp, hiding her journal beneath a loose floorboard and checking it 3 times a day to ensure it had not been disturbed. But she did not rely on Catherine alone, for she understood the danger of depending on a single frightened voice. So she began discreetly questioning others when the opportunity arose. Diner in the kitchen, who remembered the tension in Louisa's expression during her short visit to the plantation years earlier. Fisher, the overseer, who revealed, hesitantly, that another enslaved woman had lived in Rose's cabin before her, vanished suddenly without record or sale notice. And even Thomas himself, whose reaction when Rose asked an innocuous question about the river was so sharp and defensive that it told her more than any witness could. The more she uncovered, the more she saw how deeply the lie surrounding Louisa's death had been woven into the Hartwell family's life, and the more she realized she could not simply wait for Thomas to decide her fate, for men like him acted swiftly when cornered and violently when threatened, and Catherine's warning, "You look so much like her," echoed through her mind whenever she caught her reflection in the glass or noticed Thomas watching her too long. At night, Rose lay awake listening to the old house settling, her senses sharpened to every creak in the hallway, every footstep, every shift of wind against the shutters, and in those silent hours she considered the bleak possibilities ahead. If she fled, she would be hunted and likely killed. If she confronted Thomas, he would destroy her before her words could gain weight. And if she continued pretending blind obedience, she might survive a few months longer, but would eventually become another woman, tragically lost to the river. It was in those sleepless nights that Rose understood that survival would not come from hiding or waiting. Survival would come from information, timing, and turning Thomas's own methods against him. And so she made a quiet vow to herself in the darkness of the small room beside Catherine's. She would not become another forgotten story buried beneath a plantation's lies. She would not disappear into the river as Louisa had, and she would not allow Thomas Hartwell to decide the ending of her life. Instead, she would gather the truth piece by piece, hold it tightly, and use it at the moment when it could strike hardest, not with violence, but with consequences that even a respected plantation owner could not escape. As the days passed and Rose continued gathering fragments of truth, she began to understand that Thomas Hartwell's polite exterior was not merely a mask, a tightly controlled performance, and beneath it lived a man who reacted violently when he sensed even the slightest threat. This awareness settled into her bones with a cold certainty the night he summoned her to his study, closing the door behind her with a slow deliberateness that made her pulse quicken, and while he pretended to speak to her calmly, praising her care of Catherine, remarking on her intelligence, his words soon shifted into warning, revealing that he had made inquiries into her past, that he knew she had once lived with a northern Quaker family, that he believed such education planted dangerous ideas. And as he spoke, Rose kept her eyes lowered, not out of submission, but because she needed to mask the fear and fury that threatened to reveal her thoughts. His message was clear. He considered her too intelligent, too aware, and if she ever repeated anything Catherine said about Louisa, about his jealousy about the drowning, he would destroy her without hesitation. She left the study with her heartbeat pounding in her ears, knowing that Thomas had begun to suspect her, and that the fragile balance she had maintained was now dangerously thin. That same night her worst fear nearly materialized. When she awoke to the faint sound of footsteps outside Catherine's room, and as she lay perfectly still, the steps paused, then retreated, and moments later through the window she saw a lantern drifting across the yard toward the slave cabins. Its glow bobbing in the darkness like a warning signal Thomas was heading to her cabin. She acted instinctively, slipping out through the back stairway and making her way across the yard with practiced silence, arriving just in time to see him opening her cabin door, lantern held high, searching for something he was certain she had hidden, and She knew with chilling clarity that she had been moments away from exposure, for her journal, filled with every detail of his obsession, every whisper she had gathered, was still beneath the loose floorboard. Forcing her voice steady, she stepped from the shadows and pretended surprise, telling him she had come to retrieve needlework and apologizing for being out so late. And though her excuse was flimsy, it allowed Thomas to retreat with some dignity, claiming he was checking for prowlers. But Rose saw fear flicker in his eyes, fear not of her, but of what she might possess. When she returned to the main house, Catherine was awake, trembling, whispering that she had heard the footsteps too, and begging Rose to stop investigating, because she knew from experience that once Thomas felt cornered, he acted swiftly and without remorse. But Rose had crossed the threshold of caution now. Thomas's search proved he was growing desperate, which meant her time was running out. She needed a plan that would expose him without giving him the chance to silence her first. And for days she continued gathering information with the calm precision of someone preparing for a storm, listening to every conversation in the kitchen, reading every shift in Fisher's expression, watching the way Thomas's children whispered about their father's absences and the tension that clung to the house. The more she learned, the clearer it became that Thomas operated through control, isolation, and fear, using his social standing as both shield and weapon, and Rose realized that confronting him directly would fail because white society would always believe him over an enslaved woman, no matter how many truths she carried. But she also recognized something Thomas likely did not consider. Wealthy Southern planters feared scandal more than the law. They feared financial exposure more than moral accusation. And they feared whispers among their own class more than the outrage of enslaved people, whose voices they dismissed. So Rose began quietly studying Thomas's business dealings, listening during meetings she was expected to serve, noting every hint of debt, every complaint about delayed shipments, every uncomfortable remark exchanged between Thomas and his cotton factor, Hayes. She wrote everything down, disguising her notes as scripture passages or lists in her journal, and each entry strengthened her resolve to turn the very tools Thomas used, appearance, reputation, careful performance, into the weapon that might destroy him. As Catherine slowly regained fragments of strength through sharing her memories, Rose realized that their roles had shifted. Catherine, once fragile and silent, began to speak with trembling but undeniable conviction about her sister's diary, about the suspicions she had kept hidden for a decade, while Rose, once merely a caretaker, had become the keeper of their combined truth. They shared long whispers at night about Louisa's final days, about how Catherine's father dismissed her fears, about the way Thomas hid his possessiveness behind gestures of charm and generosity, and together they formed a secret alliance, two women trapped in different forms of bondage, bound by the same dangerous knowledge and the same man who controlled their lives. Each night Rose lay awake imagining Thomas's next move, aware that at any moment he might attempt to remove her from the main house, send her away, or worse, stage another accident along the riverbank. And as she listened to the steady breathing of the sleeping house, she made a silent promise that she would not meet the same fate as Louisa or the unnamed woman before her, that she would not vanish into the river leaving only rumors behind. Instead, she would strike first, with a plan that relied not on strength, but on the very thing Thomas had underestimated, her ability to observe, to document, and to expose him not through violence, but through truth sharpened into a weapon he could not anticipate nor easily escape. Rose's plan began to take shape quietly, shaped by long nights of wakefulness and days spent moving through the house as though nothing had changed, and she understood that if she wanted to survive, she needed not just evidence but a moment. One moment when the truth could be revealed in front of people who mattered, people Thomas could not silence with a glare or dismiss with a lie. For days she watched him carefully, learning the exact rhythms of his routine, the evenings he held business meetings, the hours he drank whiskey with neighboring planters, the moments when his guard slipped just enough for his arrogance to show. And it was during one of these Thursday gatherings that she realized her opportunity. Each week, Thomas met with his cotton factor Hayes, the neighbor Crawford, and a merchant from Augusta, Men who trusted him with money, crops, and shipping schedules, men whose reputations were tied to his honesty, and Rose knew that if a scandal touched his financial dealings, his position in the county would collapse more quickly than any whisper of murder ever could. She understood the social code of white Southern elites. They would overlook cruelty, overlook violence, overlook the mysterious deaths of women. They would not overlook deceit in business, and certainly not deceit that cost them profit. So she began preparing with careful precision, copying key entries from her journal into a more organized set of notes, documenting each irregularity in Thomas's ledgers, each shipment discrepancy she overheard, each muttered complaint Hayes thought no one heard. She rewrote Catherine's recounting of Louisa's final days in crisp, measured handwriting, removing emotion so that the words read like cold fact instead of grief. And she added Fisher's remark about the previous enslaved woman who had vanished, creating a chain of events that any reasonable reader would see as a pattern rather than coincidence. She wrapped the journal in oilcloth and hid it beneath a new floorboard, replacing the old loose one so Thomas would not know she had changed hiding places. And when Thursday arrived, she moved through the day as though nothing were amiss, serving meals, tending to Catherine, and waiting for night to fall with a tension that tightened her breath. Yet her movements remained calm, steady, and obedient, because obedience was the camouflage that had kept her alive this long. As men gathered in Thomas's study and their laughter drifted through the house with the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke, Rose appeared at the doorway with the coffee tray just as she always did, her face composed, her voice respectful, and she poured each cup without shaking even though Hayes, Crawford, and Preston represented the exact witnesses she needed. Once dismissed, she walked down the hallway, past the staircase, out the back door, and into the night where the air was thick and humming with insects, and she moved toward the river as though drawn by fate, placing the journal exactly where it needed to be, far enough from the water to remain dry, close enough that a search party would find it, hidden just partially so its discovery would seem accidental rather than staged. She tore a piece of her shawl and hooked it on a branch, disturbed the mud to resemble a struggle, leaving footprints that suggested panic rather than calm calculation, and as she stepped back to look at the scene she created, she felt both terror and resolve, knowing she had just committed herself to a path with no turning back. Then she returned to the main house, speaking loudly enough in the kitchen for others to hear that she was bringing fresh coffee to the study again, a detail designed to place her inside the house and establish her innocence should anyone question her movements in the morning. And when her chores were done, she climbed quietly to the small room beside Catherine's and lay in the darkness with her heart pounding, replaying every step, every risk, every detail she might have overlooked. Sleep came only in brief waves, broken by thoughts of Thomas finding the journal first or the river washing it away overnight. But each time she forced herself back into stillness because dawn would demand calm and panic would be fatal. By the time morning light touched the plantation, she was ready. The perfection of her plan depended on her reaction appearing genuine, her presence appearing ordinary, her face showing confusion, not expectation. When the alarm rose, and when Fisher's shouts filled the yard and men ran toward the river with urgency, Rose descended the stairs quietly, appearing in the hallway at the exact moment needed, stepping into a performance that would determine life or death, knowing that everything she had done, every whisper gathered, every truth recorded, every step taken in the dark, was leading to this turning point where her survival depended not on strength, but on her ability to let the truth fall into the hands of men who never imagined an enslaved woman could outmaneuver one of their own. The moment the search party returned from the river carrying the oilcloth bundle, Rose felt the entire balance of power on the plantation shift, not suddenly like a storm but slowly, like a great structure beginning to crack from within, and she watched Fisher's conflicted expression as he held the journal in his hands, his voice uneasy as he explained that the riverbank showed signs of struggle and that someone recently, had been there. When Thomas stepped forward to seize the bundle, his movements too sharp, too urgent, Fisher instinctively pulled it back just enough to signal to everyone present that something was wrong, and in that hesitation the truth Rose had been building for weeks entered the world, no longer contained in her hidden floorboard or within whispered confessions, but now held openly by a white man who understood the weight of what he was touching. As Fisher opened the first page and read Louisa's name aloud, Rose saw Thomas's mask fracture, the brief flash of panic in his eyes confirming more loudly than any confession could that the journal contained truths he feared. And when he lunged to snatch it away, Fisher did not surrender it. Instead, he stepped back, said firmly that the sheriff should be called, for the journal described crimes too serious to ignore. The hallway fell into a tense silence as Thomas fought to regain control, calling the journal a collection of lies, claiming Rose had been influenced by Northern ideas, insisting Catherine's testimony was tainted by illness, and accusing Fisher of overstepping his authority. But the more he insisted, the more obvious his desperation became, his voice rising, his composure thinning, his arguments circling like a trapped animal trying to claw its way out of a corner he had never expected to occupy. Rose stood with her hands folded, head slightly bowed, not because she felt fear, though it trembled beneath her ribs, but because stillness was her strongest weapon now, allowing Thomas's own unraveling to serve as testimony against him. For the first time, Catherine stepped forward publicly, her voice trembling but clear as she declared that the journal reflected her own memories, that she believed her sister had been murdered, that she had been silenced for years by fear and manipulation, and Thomas's reaction, violent, furious, commanding her back to her room, only strengthened her credibility in the eyes of those watching. Fisher, bolstered by Catherine's courage, repeated that the sheriff must be involved, because if the accusations were false, Thomas should welcome the chance to clear his name. But Thomas knew all too well that an investigation would reveal more than unflattering rumors. It would expose the quiet pattern of disappearance, obsession, and financial deceit he had maintained for years, and he began to sputter denials so frantic they served as their own form of confession. Rose listened silently until she realized this was her moment to strike the final blow, the moment she had planned for when she crafted her journal not just as a record but as leverage. And when she spoke, her voice was gentle yet devastating, pointing out that the journal did not only contain accusations about Louisa, but detailed notes about Thomas's debts, his unbalanced ledgers, his questionable dealings with Crawford and Hayes, details she had heard as she poured coffee at meetings where she was invisible, details that would ruin Thomas among the very men whose approval sustained his social position. The color drained from Thomas's face, not at the mention of murder but at the threat of financial disgrace, because even a powerful planter could not survive accusations that endangered other men's wealth. And Rose saw in that moment that she had pierced him in exactly the place where he was weakest. The arguments dissolved into a thick silence. As the reality settled over everyone present, Thomas Hartwell could no longer control the narrative, no longer dictate which truths lived and which disappeared into river currents or sealed ledgers. With his authority crumbling, he lashed out in one last attempt to recover dominance, declaring that Fisher was dismissed, that Rose was sold, that Catherine would be sent away. But the words rang hollow now, and issued by a man who knew he was already losing the ground beneath his feet. When Fisher insisted again on taking the journal to the sheriff, Thomas realized he could no longer stop him without revealing his guilt even more openly, and for the first time since Rose had arrived on the plantation, she saw true terror flicker across his features, the terror of a man who had always controlled others and now found himself the one being watched. The sheriff was summoned, not because anyone expected legal justice. Rose knew the law considered her words worthless, but because the journal had already done its work. Neighbors would hear, business partners would withdraw, society would whisper, and Thomas would be left without allies. As men moved back and forth through the hallway, carrying word of the sheriff's findings and speaking in low tones, the plantation seemed to shift under Rose's feet, as though the land itself sensed the fall of the man who had ruled it with such polished cruelty, and she remained still, calm, watching the cracks widen, understanding that her survival was no longer a faint hope, but the emerging truth of a plan executed with precision, patience, and the unflinching courage Catherine had first ignited the night she whispered, "You look like her, and he will do to you what he did to my sister." The sheriff's arrival marked the moment when the façade Thomas had built for years finally collapsed, though not in a dramatic instant but in a slow, humiliating unraveling that left the entire plantation suspended in a strange, breathless quiet. And as the deputies followed Fisher toward the study, Rose stood in the hallway with her hands clasped, aware that every step taken by those men brought her closer to the moment when her life would no longer be at the mercy of Thomas Hartwell. The sheriff, a stout man with a reputation for strictness when money or white reputation was at stake, listened to Fisher's account with narrowed eyes, his expression shifting subtly with every detail that pointed not only to potential violence but to financial irregularities, and Rose noticed immediately that it was the hints of ledger tampering, not the mention of Louisa's death, that tightened his jaw because in the South of that era, a planter might escape suspicion for a woman's drowning but rarely for dishonesty among men of the same class. When the sheriff began reading the journal aloud, his voice steady and unhurried, Rose saw Thomas pacing like a caged animal, his anger rising in hot, desperate spurts as he interrupted again and again, insisting the entries were forged, that Rose was mentally unstable, that Catherine was confused, and that Fisher had been conspiring against him. But the more he shouted, the more the sheriff's expression hardened, as though he were recognizing a man who had become too comfortable with the idea that his word alone could erase truth. Catherine, pale but resolute, stepped forward once more, this time with a steadiness Rose had not seen in her before, stating clearly that the handwriting describing Louisa's final weeks matched her sister's, that the tone reflected conversation she herself had overheard, and that she had been silenced by Thomas's threats for years. And her calmness in the face of Thomas's explosive denial created a contrast so stark that even the deputies shifted uncomfortably. Rose could feel the atmosphere tightening around Thomas, not because the law believed an enslaved woman's personal testimony, but because the journal's details aligned too perfectly with real financial discrepancies, and the idea that Thomas might have been lying to his peers, men who depended on him for honest transactions, struck harder than any accusation of violence could. The sheriff closed the journal with a heavy thud and demanded to see the plantation ledgers, the freight receipts, and the cotton shipment records, and Rose watched Thomas's face go gray, for he understood exactly what the sheriff would find: missing dates, inflated yield numbers, altered signatures, and evidence that he had been manipulating accounts to hide the cost of his impulsive purchases and declining production. Reluctantly, he led them to his study, and as the men opened the ledgers and compared them to the journal's notes, a suffocating silence spread through the room, broken only by the sheriff's terse remarks confirming each discrepancy Rose had documented. Outside the study, the enslaved workers gathered in small clusters, whispering cautiously, glancing toward Rose with a mixture of awe and fear, for they understood that something monumental was unfolding, something none of them had ever imagined possible, the slow dismantling of the master's authority not by rebellion or escape, but by the truth placed into the hands of white men who could not ignore it. As the investigation deepened, Thomas's composure shattered entirely, and he lashed out at everyone around him, accusing Hayes of betrayal, accusing Crawford of poisoning the sheriff against him, accusing Catherine of manipulation, and at last shouting at Rose with open hatred, calling her the source of all his troubles. But instead of lunging toward her as he once might have, he was held back by deputies who no longer saw him as the unquestioned authority of the plantation, but as a man under scrutiny. Catherine stepped subtly closer to Rose, signaling a quiet alliance that grew stronger with every moment. Thomas lost control, and Rose stood firmly, keeping her gaze low but her presence unshakable, fully aware that silence now was more powerful than speech. By the afternoon, it was clear to everyone that Thomas had not only falsified accounts, but had also failed to report 2 prior accidents involving enslaved women who had disappeared under circumstances too similar to Louisa's to ignore, and though the sheriff did not arrest him, Southern law protected white men far too thoroughly for that. He did issue a formal summons to answer charges in the county court, a humiliation severe enough to shatter Thomas's standing among the neighboring planters. As evening shadows lengthened across the fields, Rose could feel the shift ripple outward through the entire estate. Workers moved with cautious hope, the children whispered in uncertain tones, and even the wind along the river seemed to carry a quieter, lighter breath, as though acknowledging the fall of a man who had ruled through fear and control. Thomas retreated to his study that night, slamming the door with a violence that rattled the house, and for the first time since Rose had arrived on the plantation, the threat he represented felt weakened, not gone entirely but cracked deeply enough that she could finally breathe. And as she walked back toward Catherine's room, she understood that her plan had not merely exposed him, it had stripped him of the power to decide her future, reshaping the fate he had once intended for her and turning it instead into the beginning of a long-awaited reckoning. In the days that followed, the Hartwell plantation shifted into a strange, suspended quiet, as though the land itself were catching its breath after years of holding the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. Rose sensed that the final unraveling of Thomas Hartwell was no longer something she had to push. It was something already in motion, something collapsing under its own corrupted weight. The summons from the county court spread quickly among the neighboring estates, traveling through parlors, taverns, and churchyards, and with every whisper Thomas's power shrank, his allies distancing themselves with the ease of men protecting their own reputations. And soon the visitors to the plantation changed. No longer planters seeking advice or merchants eager for business, but men delivering notices, demands, and questions he could not ignore. Catherine, though still fragile, moved with a new quiet strength, gathering the remnants of her sister's belongings, speaking softly with Fisher, and refusing to return to the fearful silence Thomas had once forced upon her. And Rose realized that Catherine was no longer a woman trapped by grief, but one awakening from years of manipulation, standing taller each day as she reclaimed the parts of herself Thomas had tried to break. Fisher, too, walked differently, no longer shrinking under Thomas's orders but moving with the confidence of a man who had chosen the right side of truth, and he made it known, carefully but firmly, that any retaliation against Rose would be met with the sheriff's attention, a threat Thomas could not risk now that his every action was watched by men eager to see him fall further. But even as his authority crumbled, Thomas remained dangerous, pacing the plantation like a wounded predator, muttering to himself, shouting at servants, drinking heavily, and locking himself in his study for hours as though searching for some loophole, some trick of words or money that could undo what had been set into motion. Yet each day brought another blow to his pride, a cancelled contract, a withdrawn partnership, a letter from Hayes severing all business ties, and by the end of the week, the once mighty planter stood isolated inside a house that no longer obeyed him. The final breaking point arrived on a humid afternoon when a deputy rode up the path with a sealed notice demanding Thomas appear in court within 3 days and present the full financial records of the plantation. And when Thomas read it, something in him snapped, a quiet, frightening crack that Rose witnessed from the far end of the hallway as he staggered backward, gripping the doorway as though the ground itself had betrayed him. That night, the house shook with the sound of him destroying his study, ripping ledgers apart, throwing chairs against walls, and shouting at ghosts only he could see, and Rose felt an icy dread that he might still lash out at her or Catherine in one final, desperate attempt to regain control. But Fisher stationed himself near the staircase, and several enslaved men lingered outside the house, ready, not out of affection but out of shared necessity, to prevent Thomas from dragging the plantation back into the shadows of fear. At dawn, the house fell silent, and when Rose entered the study cautiously with Fisher at her side, they found Thomas slumped at the desk, his whiskey bottle half empty and his expression hollow, and though he lived, he looked nothing like the man who once commanded the plantation with polished arrogance. He looked like a man defeated by truths he could no longer outrun. 3 days later, he left the plantation under the watch of deputies, riding toward the county seat with a posture that sagged lower with each mile, and it was said later that he never regained his former standing, that the court hearings exposed more deception than even Rose had uncovered, and that he spent his remaining years drifting between distant relatives' homes, avoided by the very men who once praised him. With Thomas gone, the plantation changed in ways that felt small at first but grew more significant with each passing week. Fisher took over management, treating the enslaved workers with a degree of fairness that, while far from freedom, made survival less brutal. Catherine wrote to her family in Savannah and began preparing to leave, determined never to return to a place haunted by her sister's memory and her husband's cruelty. And Rose, for the first time since arriving, walked the grounds without feeling the weight of someone watching her, each step lighter than the last, though she knew her future still depended on forces far beyond her control. But when Catherine approached her one afternoon, eyes soft but resolute, and handed her a sealed letter addressed to the Northern Quaker family she once lived with, Rose felt a tremor of hope she had not allowed herself to imagine. Catherine had written to them, explaining everything, asking if they would take Rose back, offering payment and promising legal steps to secure her freedom. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, the letter felt like a doorway opening, a path leading away from the river that had once seemed destined to swallow her life. On the evening before Catherine's departure, the two women stood together on the veranda, the sky painted in soft gold, and Rose felt the wind brush her face with a gentleness that seemed like a blessing, as though Louisa herself were whispering that the cycle had finally been broken. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, Rose understood that she had not only survived, she had rewritten the fate Thomas intended for her, turning a story of danger and silence into one of courage, truth, and the quiet, powerful reclamation of her own life.